Were biblical writers historians? And were they writing histories? Did anybody in antiquity have a sense of history? By that I mean, was any ancient person aware that past and present are qualitatively different, and not simply in what order things happen? For ancient people like our biblical ancestors in the faith, the expectation was to live up to the past. You see, to them, past and present had the same quality. Therefore, stories of the past must be the norm and pedagogue for living today, legitimating the status quo. How radically different from our modern idea that the past does not need to be cloned by the present, and that status quo can and should be challenged. All of this impacts how we read so-called salvation history into our sacred stories. Did biblical authors, or Irenaeus of Lyon for that matter, hold to Western linear views of time heralded by popular speakers like Scott Hahn and Jeff Cavins and their Calvinist-influenced charts? Did they read the scriptures as an 18th century novel with plot and climax? Did they distinguish between fact and fiction, between history and story?
When you know that ancient writers told stories as a means of getting across ideas, and they didn't tell stories to report to you the news of the day, again, it raises the question, how do we know what is historical and what is not? Now, this list just absolutely blows my mind. This is, the Gospel of John does not have a single one of these things in it. Does not have the temptation in the wilderness, rejection and death, not a single parable. Virtually every New Testament scholar I know would say to you that if there is anything in the sayings of Jesus that's likely historical, it's the parables. There's not a single one in John. The Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes are not in John. The Lord's Prayer is not in John. All these stories, Peter's confession, the Transfiguration. I mean, there's some really good stories there. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean John didn't know them, never heard them? Or does it mean he knew them and decided not to use them? John does tell us in his gospel, right at the end, he said there are many other things Jesus said and did that are not written in this book. That suggests that he knew more than he wrote down. But come on, you don't put in the Lord's Prayer? This is even more amazing. These are in John and John alone. The prologue on "In the beginning was the Word," all of that. The wedding in Cana. Nicodemus' story. This guy coming to Jesus at night and asking all these... This dialogue goes on. The story of the woman at the well. Now, what's the matter? They didn't know that story? Or did they know it again and choose not to use it? All the I am sayings, I am the bread of life, I am the door, I am the resurrection and the life. All of those I am sayings that are in the Gospel of John, nowhere else in early Christian literature. Nowhere. So did Jesus say any of those, or are those the creation of early Christian preachers using Jesus' stories? Difficult to tell. It gets much more difficult. Remember the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery? That one is especially interesting. It's in the Gospel of John now. It almost certainly was not in the original Gospel of John. And it's in no other early Christian writing, and it's a great story. And when you look in the Gospel of John, it's very obvious that it's been inserted into the text because it breaks up the train of thought. So it's been rather clumsily inserted. And you can hypothesize that somebody read John and said, come on, bird brain, you can't leave that one out. It's too good a story. And stuck it in. Does that mean it's not from the historical Jesus? It may well be from the historical Jesus. And somebody thought it was too good a story to leave out and so inserted it awkwardly in the Gospel of John, but nowhere else in all of early Christian literature. I am the light of the world. They don't know that. I'm the good shepherd. None of this. This is the bombshell. No other early Christian writing tells the story of the raising of Lazarus. Now think about that, folks. If that actually occurred as a historical event, can you imagine that word wouldn't spread like wildfire? And so why is it not in any other gospel? Not only the 4 in the New Testament, it's nowhere else in early Christian writing. Maybe it's a theological creation, not a historical event. And again, we got to try to figure out how are we going to tell the difference. Foot washing at the Last Supper, that one's puzzling too. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's about the sharing of bread and wine, right? They don't do that in John. It's a foot washing. We've sort of dumped the John version and we follow the Matthew, Mark, and Luke versions. Does that mean John didn't know about the sharing of bread and wine? Does it mean that Matthew, Mark, and Luke never heard of the foot washing thing? The Pope, the new Pope, bless his heart. Did y'all see the news story about him washing the feet of a woman? And the Italian bishops were scandalized. Good for him. But that doesn't appear in any other gospel. This stuff, not a single one of those stories appears in any other Christian literature. Now, you can tell that in trying to sort our way through this, we have to develop some fairly careful criteria by which we will make judgments about what is historical and what is not. We also have to come to terms with the fact that some of the history doesn't matter. Whether Jesus was crucified on Thursday or Friday is not a great issue in my life. It might be a great issue whether or not he is the Lamb of God slain for the sins of the world. So theologically, that story might have great meaning to me. Historically, it has none whatsoever. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to try to sort out what's historical and what's not, but also what's important that it's historical and what's not. Would everybody agree here that the crucifixion, it's important that that's a historical event? Christianity would change fundamentally if that were not a historical event. But the day of the week doesn't matter much. So we got a big sort job, and we have to be very, very careful in working out criteria for how we'll make judgments among all these things.
Before the Enlightenment, history was much more story than anything remotely like historiographical recording and research. You got to keep that in mind when you read something like Acts of the Apostles. For the 18th century Romantics reacting to the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment, human life unfolded like a novel. Everything a novel has, they thought, so life must also have, including characterization, plot, progression, dramatic close, etc. Literary criticism applies all that Romantic era stuff to the Bible. But we have to ask, is that a legitimate way of looking at the Bible? Is it respectful of the ancients and how they actually viewed things? You know, much of this is in reality anachronism. It's just alien to how biblical writers saw their world and got in it. Many popular Catholic figures teach the Bible as if it housed a novel story. Look at Jeff Cavins and how popular his method is in parishes, how it is said to unlock the Bible. Many commentators treat the biblical stories like narratives in a novel, all peopled by characters bearing deeply psychological motivations. This, of course, is recognizable to us Westerners, who are very psychological, so individualistic, so introspective. We've all been schooled by Joseph Campbell, whether we know it or not. But is it there, or are we ethnocentrically putting it into the scriptures?